Welcome to our new episode. We have with us Dr. Rachel Bryan, and she is a postdoctoral research fellow at All Souls College, Oxford. She's researching English literature, and her research spans across the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. She focuses largely on literature shaped by the aftermath of warfare, societal change, things like this, times of upheaval. And she has an upcoming book, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, called 20th Century Literature in the Aftermath of War,
That's
which
right.
will
Yep.
be out when? When will this be out?
November of this year with Cambridge University Press.
Amazing. So everyone should look out for that book coming up. And so from what I can tell from your research, you're very interested in a kind of a variety of topics and periods and things like this, but you're very drawn to literature surrounding people impacted by war, times of upheaval, law and legality, and aftermaths of political change. So I know a lot of graduate students find it very difficult to pinpoint their research on something or someone. And I was wondering what you think of that process of kind of pinpointing what or who resonates with you, what or who to study. How do you approach that process, and what led you to your own research?
That's such a good question. And I think it's a really important question actually to ask yourself, not only when you're a graduate student, but to keep
Yeah.
asking yourself throughout your career, because reflecting on how you ended up getting to where you are can be really revelatory. I think in terms of advice for graduate students, I often say this to my own students. I say, have you got any unfinished business? Things that you've read and things that have made you really excited about literature or about criticism, but that you haven't quite found satisfactory answers to yet, either
Yeah.
because you haven't read enough or you've read some of the critical work and you've thought, well, that doesn't sort of pinpoint it for me. I've got something I want to work out and dig down into. So I think being sensitive to your own curiosities can be really helpful and be a great route into new areas of discovery. I also think talking to your mentors, to your peers, taking recommendations for new routes of reading and discovery can be really helpful. And I think actually as well, being open to the fact that research very seldom ends up looking exactly how you think it's going to. So you can start thinking, I'm going to be, I don't know, a feminist critic, or I'm going to approach things from this perspective. And then you can find in the course of your research that your identity changes or shifts, or you incorporate new voices or new methodologies. And being receptive enough to that process, being organic, I think can be really helpful. In terms of the story of how I got to my sort of research interests, I think I'm a combination of those two things that I've just described. So I went to a university that allowed you to do 2 dissertations in the final year of your undergrad, which was really wonderful. And I knew from very, very early on that one of them wanted to be looking at, what you've described in terms of my interest in war and literary responses to war, and also, the aftermath of war and those times of reckoning. And I've been interested in the Second World War in particular from when I was quite young, actually. I'd read a lot of really wonderful children's literature about it, like Judith Kerr's novels, and I'd worked a little bit with the Holocaust Educational Trust when I was a teenager, and this had been a big interest for me. So I knew that one of my dissertations, I wanted to look actually at war crime trial reporting, and I wrote about Rebecca West and Hannah Arendt, who West wrote about the Nuremberg trials for the New Yorker, and Arendt reported on the Eichmann trial for the New Yorker. And I was really interested in looking at how writing about unprecedented crimes and difficult individuals and how the struggle of writing about them in a literary context, I found fascinating. So that was a very sort of easy choice for me. For my second dissertation, I had this vague idea that I was interested in objects that break in early 20th century novels. So I wandered into my director of studies' office and said something quite vague like that. And she was brilliant and very receptive and perceptive and said, go and read The Golden Bowl by Henry James. And I had no James at all up until this point. And I read that novel and I found it incredibly difficult. And it's when his syntax and style are really quite strange, but I got hooked. So I wrote both of these dissertations. My master's thesis, I stayed with James. And when I was a PhD student, I started with James, but I ended up looking at James as a writer responding to war and conflict. Two of his brothers fought in the American Civil War, and he dies in the midst of the First World War. And then I took that and I used it as a starting point to look at the broader 20th century. So I brought in other later writers like Elizabeth Bowen, Rebecca West, Kazuo Ishiguro, and built a project around that. And alongside sort of the work I've been doing on that first book, my two other research projects at the moment are editing a Henry James novel for Cambridge University Press's new complete fiction, and a project that looks at collective and inherited guilt and extra-legal guilt, so guilt outside the law's definition of guilt, and how that's written about in post-war literature. So all of these things have sort of come back together, but in quite an organic way. And I suppose if my example teaches people anything, it's that, you know, both following your own instincts and also listening to advice of mentors can take you on all kinds of interesting academic journeys. And I think, keep the excitement going and keep being willing to explore would probably be my best advice to them. And enjoy it.
Yeah, definitely. That is an amazing kind of collection of kind of pathways that you've gone down. And I think they do have this one thread running through them of change and upheaval. And I mean, I guess Henry James, he has that pragmatism aspect of his text, you know, which I also find incredibly challenging. We also had to study him in one of my seminars at Cambridge, and very, very, very challenging. I'm not sure what you thought of him and the ways in which he incorporates his philosophy into his literature, but I do think even that has aspects of this kind of political molding of, you know, politics and literature into a text, kind of what you were saying about Bowen as well. They do meld their literature and their politics, I think, very closely together. And I think that really gives for some interesting conversations and interesting texts. But in your All Souls College profile, you write that you want to, quote, fully understand the relationship between modern warfare and literary art. And I think that's very well said, very concise. And I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about this relationship, what it entails, and what you see as the most notable effects of modern warfare on literature, and of also on literature on modern warfare. Is there like some kind of relationship that maybe goes both ways? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Wow, that's such a good question. So I think what I was saying when I was talking about sort of more fully understanding it, it's a very, very complicated and rich issue. And I suppose my own work has been trying to nuance a particular part of that. So if I take the second half of that question first, I'll maybe talk about what interests me about the relationship first off, which I think is this strange sense that times of war or sort of mass violence or political violence seem to me to be times when the creation of art seems most urgent, but also almost impossible at the same time. And that tension and that paradox has always intrigued me. So there's an idea that there's some kind of answer to destruction in creation, which can be quite powerful, I think, for writers and thinkers. But this is also a time where we have really interesting ethical conversations about, you know, experiences in the extremes of life and whether actually the authenticity of literary representation can be challenged. So if you're, if for example, you know, you're writing about, you know, I don't know, being on the front lines in a kind of war situation, and the intensity of that experience, whether it can pass into literary discourse and still feel authentic, or whether something is lost, whether we're always distorting experiences when we're writing about them. And these questions become incredibly important, I think, in the aftermath of wars, but particularly in terms of atrocities or genocides, you know, this idea where witness testimony and the ability of the discursive arts to tell stories is really important. But there's also a risk about, you know, distorting or creating something beautiful out of something that has as its heart, you know, horrors and atrocities. So all of those tensions I find really interesting. And I also think that thinking about literature's relationship to war and conflict brings you into all kinds of questions about our relationship to pain and suffering, to ethics and aesthetics. And it's a really rich area of study. It's a way of, I suppose, allowing our appreciation to literature to ask us all kinds of really important questions about morality and mortality and all of those essential questions. In terms of my own work, I've been really interested in, I suppose, adding to a conversation about what are the impacts of particularly so modern warfare on literature. And this is partly because there's been a long tradition of literary criticism that you probably know about that thinks a lot about the relationship between particularly the First World War and what we call literary modernism. So this idea that one of the first major total wars and one of the first big mechanized wars can be sort of traced onto the stylistic experimentation of your high modernists like sort of Woolf, Eliot, Pound, people like that. And there's been a lot of interesting work done in recent years that's actually said, well, modernism pre-exists the First World War. It's actually a movement that is, defining itself and even mutating in the years before the First World War. But what's persisted in criticism that I find interesting is this relationship between writing about war and conflict in a kind of authentic or representative way and very stylistically innovative pieces of work. So fractured syntax, warped temporalities, this idea of sort of trauma producing a kind of traumatic aesthetic. And my own work's been interested in adding a sort of counter narrative to that example and saying, well, there's a lot of literary evidence to say that responses to war are actually attentive to people's idea people's sort of urge, I suppose, to not innovate and renovate, but actually to go back to the pre-war world, to keep myths going, to almost exist as though war had never been. There's a great example of a letter that Catherine Mansfield writes to her husband, John Middleton Murray, about a year after the end of the First World War. And she's writing about Virginia Woolf's novel Night and Day. And she's essentially calls this book a, quote, lie in the soul. And she's angry because she feels as though Woolf has written a book as though the First World War had never happened. And Mansfield says, that the settling down of human beings is really, sort of challenging for me. I don't believe that anything can ever be the same again, and that writers that pretend this is the case are sort of missing the point. But when I read that letter, I get really interested in people who wanted to pretend that the world had been the same, or wanted to write novels as though the world was the same, because that in itself is a response to war and conflict, this need to perpetuate traditions and this need to carry on thinking as in the old world, or to continue sympathies with the old world. And this, as you can probably tell, led into my interest in counterfactuals, or these sort of consolatory imaginative structures that maybe literature shaped by war and conflict has this dual aspect to it, both the sort of an allegiance to innovative aesthetics and embracing the brave new world, as well as acknowledging the destruction. But there's also, I think, a whole body of post-war literature that's more attentive to how people, in Elizabeth Bowen's phrase, survive not only physically, but spiritually, carry on going. And they often do that by looking back to older structures and older traditions and older ways of writing and thinking. So that's how I've sort of come at that question. And I think there's some interesting relationships there to dig into.
Yeah, I love what you were talking about when you were touching on form and how form features in times of upheaval, times of, the aftermath of war and things like this. It makes me also wonder, when we have a kind of very rigid narrative form, is that the form of the ruling class? Is that the form of traditional classical literature and all types of broken experimental form? Allen Ginsberg, Kathy Acker, these kinds of very experimental poets, and novelists. Are they referring to some kind of internal societal trauma, or even when they're not writing in a time of war, are they gesturing to some kind of trauma inherent in society? It makes me wonder.
I mean, it could be. It's interesting, isn't it? Because there's a long sort of association with certain forms and traditional structures and conservatism, right? The novel is often seen as a very conservative form of writing, but its allegiances are with particular ways of viewing the world. Ideas of character is quite rigid, and in the 19th century, it's also tied in lots of ways to the rule of law and the status quo, and that innovative forms are often associated with conceptual challenges, aesthetics and aesthetic challenges and I think conceptual challenges are tied together in a really interesting way. But I think, one of the things that we get to do as literary critics is to think about those sort of generalizations and find test cases for them. And actually, there are points where more traditional forms can have more subtle innovations within them, that they can find a way of talking back within frameworks rather than outside of them. But I think you're right that there is something about brokenness that makes you think about its relationship to more rigid power structures, certainly. And those writers are really good examples of that you've noted there.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I would love to kind of, you were mentioning law and legality and the nature of law shaping a kind of form as prescribed as, the novel or a kind of a verse or whatever it may be. But I was wondering what you think about how the law features in the reception of literature during times of immense societal change, when laws are changing, when laws are being rejected, when laws are being contested. How does the law feature, I guess, is the first question, in the literature, and how?
Wow. Yeah. So I mean, again, it's a broad issue. So in terms of my own interest, I think I'm most interested in times where literary discourse or works of literature kind of use their own qualities as works of imaginative art to talk back to legal discourse. So if the law defines personhood or guilt in a particular way, how literature can challenge that. And some of my favorite examples of this are actually from the 19th century. And I think that's a really good place to go if you're first kind of interested in this. So I often think about Dickens's novel Bleak House, which is a wonderful work, a very long book, but a great book if you're interested in thinking about literature and the law. And there are some wonderful examples of this where Dickens is using fictional discourse to actually expose what we might think of as legal fiction. So literature actually talks back to the law and says, well, there's something about the way law accounts for people that's slightly fanciful or imaginative. So a good example would be the fact that one of the two narrators of that novel is someone called Esther Summerson. And she was illegitimate. So she was born when her parents weren't married. And in the eyes of the law, in that particular time period, illegitimate people didn't have any relations, so they didn't have any family. And there's a wonderful scene in that novel where a lawyer called Mr. Kenge has to explain to the young Esther Summerson that this lady is her aunt in fact, but in law she doesn't have an aunt. So there's a strange way in which this child has to learn that you can't just lose relatives by them dying. You can lose relatives because the law sort of erases them. And there are other examples in that novel, like when Esther meets a chancellor who does not recognize illegitimate people because the law does not recognize illegitimate people. Dickens writes about the fact that he doesn't meet her eye. So it's literally cannot look at this person. There's another character in that novel who had been declared legally dead, as you could be in that period if you hadn't been seen or heard of for 7 years. And he's walking around London as a kind of extra legal ghost. So Dickens is sort of using their literary discourse to write back. In my own work, I'm sort of interested in another kind of dialogue with the law. I'm really interested in the period after the Second World War, when you've got sort of the big war crime trials and tribunals, and the world is sort of trying to come to terms with the legacies of war crimes, both in the Pacific theatre of war and in the European theatre of war. And this is a time where Hannah Arendt is writing about how Nazi crime has, quote, exploded the limits of the law. So this is a time where the law has to sort of show itself to be adequate to a world where all of these terrible things have happened and that some kind of reckoning and restitution can still occur. And one of the things that's a big tension here is that the law will prosecute individuals. It can't prosecute entire nations. So this idea of collective guilt doesn't really have a legal basis. Arendt writes about how it's only in a metaphorical sense that you can be guilty for what your father did or your grandfather or, the people in the same country as you, that, you can only be tried in a legal sense for what you actually did. And whilst I'm not convinced that literary texts are sort of critiquing what was going on directly in these war crime trials, it's more that they're giving a home to these sort of more extra legal feelings of guilt. So there are a lot of texts around the mid-century that want to write about this feeling of collective guilt, an idea that an entire nation can feel some kind of guilt or culpability for things that have happened in the war. Or, you think about the second generations in Germany that who are thinking about their grandparents or their grandfathers and what they did. And those feelings find their way into literature, even if they're not, sort of being represented in legal discourse. And one of the things that I'm fascinated by is how literary style does a lot of that work. So there's a really wonderful novel from 1955 called The World, My Wilderness by someone called Rose Macaulay. And it's a novel that's sort of set in the ruinscapes of London in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And it's a novel where everybody sort of feels guilty and appears to be guilty for something. But stylistically, it's interesting because none of the characters are given sort of enough substance for you to think about them in terms of having personal motivations. They're quite sort of insubstantial. There's a lot of syntax where it's difficult to know who's the subject of verbs and whose actions belong to who. It also talks back to Greek myth and Greek tragedy in a really interesting way that seems to sort of support this idea that guilt can be inherited, or that you can perform actions not because you want to, but because some kind of external force is pushing you to do that. And my interest, I suppose, as a literary critic is thinking about what kind of talking back to the law is this doing? So I think in answer to sort of your question, I'm in times where the law is trying to do some kind of work, a sort of stabilizing motion, extra legal discourses, so discourses that are not the law or outside the law, of which literature is one, can do interesting forms of talking back or criticism or putting pressure. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about, the different ways in which people and society are being conceived of. The law is not the only way of sort of accounting for people and their actions. Literature does a lot of that work, and it does some really exciting work when it's talking back in that way, I think.
No, definitely. That was very, very interesting. Wow, thank you for that. I find it really interesting what you were saying about the law sometimes erasing personhood or subjectivity. Like, for example, if you're a bastard child or whatever it may be, it completely negates your existence. In times like, in Bleak House and in certain cultures and societies where such children are refused to be recognized by law. And it makes me wonder about the guilt aspect, about how guilt functions in relation to the law. Kind of, can you only be guilty if the law dictates you must be guilty? Can you be guilty if the law dictates you should not be guilty? What happens when your guilt lies in disagreement with the law? I think that's very, very interesting. If the law thinks you should be guilty and you are not, or if the law thinks you should not be guilty and you are, what kind of happens then when the law is kind of our standard for guilt, and the law often is the measuring stick against we measure our guilt, such as in trial or in sentencing in court, things like this, the verdict, guilty or not guilty, as decreed by the law. So what happens when guilt actually has very little relationship with the law? I find that really interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I'm interested in, that sort of immediate post-Second World War period, where, Arendt talks about, how where all are guilty, no one is guilty. And what she's basically saying is that, guilt needs to be attached to the individual and assigned to real actions in order for it to be meaningful, right? What's the point of saying that a country of several million people are all equally guilty? It doesn't really mean anything. And that, this is a time where she's thinking about ways, I believe, of making guilt meaningful and making the law meaningful, and getting purchase on culpability and actions and accountability. But you're absolutely right that we can feel guilty for things we haven't done. We can feel guilty by association sometimes. In the psychoanalytical realm, there's all kinds of theories of guilt about actually how believing that we're guilty when we haven't done anything wrong can actually be a sort of a self-protection myth. There's aspects of psychoanalysis that talk about how children often feel guilty if they've been hurt or mistreated by parents, because they would rather believe that the world is just and they are guilty than believing that the world is unjust, right? It's actually psychologically more comforting to think that you are wrong than the whole world is wrong, that there is no moral system, and that
That's really interesting.
things are
Yeah,
a lot more dangerous. So once you actually look at all the different permutations of guilt outside its quite strict legal basis, you realize that there's all kinds of ways in which humans interact with these ideas and these emotions. But also I think you can sense why there need to be parameters as well, because actually pinning things to specifics and saying no, it's actions that matter in our system is a way of sort of controlling thoughts about human action and morality and agency that are incredibly complex. So yes,
definitely.
I think there's all kinds of interesting ways in which we can think about those ideas, and yeah, really, really,
Yeah.
really interesting.
Do you think in a kind of perfect society, the law would be our measure for guilt? Very abstract question.
Oh gosh, I don't know. It's such a tough one. I would be tempted to say that philosophers of law would argue this far better than me. Um, but oh gosh, my immediate instinct would be that that dialogue and having lots of discourses and thinking about these things, where we've got legal systems and extra legal systems, and that we think about ways of accounting for the messy business of being alive through lots of different channels,
Very
is
true.
better in general than that. But I don't want to end up sounding like an anarchist, like someone who doesn't believe in the rule of law. I don't at all. But a good and tough question that I might swerve, if that's all right with you.
No, definitely, definitely. It is kind of just a very, very abstract question because I sometimes wonder when we're talking about extra legal guilt and guilt as dictated or decreed by the law, what is the best way to kind of structure one's guilt, or where should one's guilt come from? Should it come from directly the person? Should we be guilty for the actions of others? Should we be guilty if the law says we are? I don't know. I think guilt is a really interesting thing. And I think psychoanalytically, you're completely right about where guilt comes from. It's often buried deep in childhood, Freud would probably argue. And yeah, I think guilt is one of those things that is very, very slippery and very obscure and hard to pinpoint exactly where it comes from, because in essence you are it's I wrote this essay on shame when I was in third year undergraduate, actually, on shame and Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness,
Okay,
which is
great.
a very, very depressing novel, but I think a brilliant novel, but very depressing. And shame features heavily throughout that novel, in which the main character, Stephen, she feels shame almost at every action that she can take through her own being. She's very, very ashamed of her being, and I kind of characterize shame as stepping out of yourself, out of your body, out of your subjecthood, and judging yourself externally as if you are someone else. And I think that is where shame comes in. And I think shame is it has a very interesting relationship to guilt,
Mm-hmm.
because I think it also has that similar thing of stepping out of one's body and judging oneself externally, and finding oneself wanting, finding oneself inadequate. Um, and I think just those processes of your ego kind of coming out of your being, it's really, really interesting because it's very not instinctual. It's not what should be happening. We should probably keep our head inside our being and not judge ourselves externally as if we are someone else. But I think shame and guilt are components or symptoms of this process of stepping out of yourself. And I wonder how that is reflected in literature, in subjecthood, as written about in first person narratives, as characterized by different types of literary forms. This process of stepping outside of the voice of who's speaking, and guilt just permeating throughout a text, I think is really strange to think about in some way.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of what I was trying to describe in the Macaulay example, and I think another text that I've been working with a lot on a separate project. In fact, my editorial work for the new Henry James edition, the text I'm working with is a book called The Other House, which is a novel of James's from 1896, and it's actually about an act of infanticide. So a young woman murders a small child. And she does this because the man that she loves has promised his dying wife that he would never marry another lady while their daughter was still alive. But it happens in the context of quite a close-knit society. And basically, there's another person who is also in love with this man and doesn't kill the child. But everyone who's in this society who wants this man to be happy again is sort of somehow strangely implicated in the death of this child through maybe wanting her to die so that their lives can move on. There's a whole sense in which this novel is sort of pushing at the boundaries of the fact that, yes, one woman committed this murder, but somehow everyone else had sort of murdered this child in their minds in a way by wanting certain things and longing for this marriage to take place. And it's a really fascinating novel, but similarly, a bit like in the Macaulay, a lot of this work is done at the level of style, ambiguity of pronouns, which she is being referred to at any one time, that allows the reader to have a sense that, I'm not really sure whether it's this woman who's doing the action or this woman that's doing the action. And that duality, that sort of interpretive duality, puts pressure on the idea that guilt can only attach to one person. So when you were talking just then, you had this wonderful thing of saying about, how guilt sort of spreads everywhere. It can be dissociated from the individual implicated in the action and become something that's more sort of dispersed. And I think, there are some really interesting stylistic consequences of that, or ways that authors are writing about this sort of, this spread and this unraveling. And I think both James and Macaulay are really interested in interpretive ambiguity or, sort of syntax that causes it to spread around. And that's something I think is really, really interesting, where you see it happening on the page in front of you, as you say.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think when we do get to that's really interesting about the infanticide text. That is very twisted. But speaking about that, I was thinking, when you get to a point where not only the person who commits the crime is implicated in this guilt, but actually everyone else who's ever even slightly had a thought in that direction, that at that point is where you cross over into your thoughts can be guilt provoking, or your thoughts are guilty, or your thoughts are morally wrong. You cannot think certain things, and not action, but thought. And I think that is really interesting, that actually certain thoughts can be kind of so immoral that there should be a punishment, almost a punishment for a thought. I think I've never really thought that deeply about that, because it's just very foreign concept to me. But the idea of, no, this thought is actually horrible and you're going to be tried in court for this thought. I think that's really, and I think it also gives a lot of power to thoughts, because I think oftentimes divide life into the intellectual, mental realm and the physical realm. And you can only be tried in court often for crimes committed in the physical realm, not in the intellectual realm, unless it's something like intellectual property rights. But even that veers off into the physical realm, because you're stealing copyright or something like that. That's actually physically happening. But that this process of, trying someone for their thoughts, or declaring someone guilty for their thoughts, I think gives a lot of strength to the thought, the idea of the thought. And this mental, physical actually has the mental go up a lot in strength. And I think often we decree the physical to be the more strong realm, and toppling over the mental. But if you can be, assigned guilty for a thought, actually thoughts become very, very powerful then.
And if you think about sort of, particularly because I'm very interested in sort of 20th century literature, but, the plane of incidence sort of moves in the 20th century, through modernism to thinking about mental life and being interested in mental life, and, stream of consciousness writing, and even things like free and direct discourse. So you can think about how, like we were saying, these shifts have important stylistic consequences, or that there's an interesting impact yeah, on the way that even we're sort of, if we're given access to thoughts, and so a writer like James is sort of a great example for this, because there are wonderful extended passages in late James where a lot of what you're encountering is inside a character's head. They haven't spoken for 2 or 3 pages, and yet this is what you're being given access to.
Right.
So if you think about from a reader perspective, to what extent you get to know a character through their thoughts, but also maybe that you're judging their thoughts, that the whole action has moved
Definitely.
somewhere else. So yeah, it's an interesting feature of literary style as well, what you're describing there. Absolutely.
It makes me think a lot of this is funny. It makes me think a lot of Lolita by Nabokov,
Yeah.
because you have I would say the majority of the novel takes place in his head, in terms of the characterization of Humbert Humbert. We hear very little of his thoughts being directly spoken to Lolita. All that she knows is this guy has decided to kind of take her on a road trip, and he's actually murdered her mom. She kind of understands that a bit later, but we never really hear from Lolita ever throughout the novel. We don't know any of her thoughts. We only know his. And I think that decision made by Nabokov to characterize a novel where we only have access to his mental space makes it really fascinating, because you only hear from the pedophile. You never hear from the girl that he is going after. We never hear anything about her, and hence she's characterized as this kind of dream, manic pixie dream girl, as they say. We never hear what she's actually just a 12-year-old child, right? But in his mind, she's the love of his life. So that free and direct discourse, I think, is completely accurate to this. So we're speaking to.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. I would love to also speak a little bit about this idea of the optative, which you speak a little bit about in your old Cambridge profile, when you were at Cambridge. And you classify as this idea of the optative as depicting, quote, lives unlived, desires not enacted, and what might have been. And you examine it as, quote, a psychological and syntactical force in modern and contemporary literature.
Yeah.
So what can we learn about this notion of the optative, about the presence of what could have been, right? So the kind of the featuring of the what could have been in the text or in the story, but the ultimate absence of it actually being.
Yeah. So this is something that I was really interested in during my doctoral thesis, and there's been some really wonderful work done on this by all sorts of people. There's a great critic called Andrew H. Miller who's looked at this in relation to 19th century realism, and there's also a wonderful psychoanalyst and writer called Adam Phillips who has a book called Missing Out, which is all about people thinking about their unlived lives, and Phillips's argument is that sort of in modernity, when you've got this sort of proliferation of choices, right, and also thinking about sort of capitalism and consumer society, it's all about having more and more choices and more options. And he talks about sort of modern cultures, and I think he's thinking a little bit here about sort of even the long sort of shadow cast by sort of transcendentalist thought that comes out of America in the 19th century, this idea that a person, what is valuable is about giving people a chance to fulfill all of their potential. It's all about sort of not just living a good life but a full life. And he says because of this, that people end up sort of thinking about what they miss out on, what they won't have had a chance to achieve and do, and that becomes more precious, and that it's difficult to imagine ourselves without thinking about what we haven't done, that we almost sort of define ourselves through those spaces. And I found this really, really interesting. I was particularly sort of struck because one of the writers that I worked on in my doctorate was someone called Elizabeth Bowen. And Bowen, in a 1944 short story called Mysterious Core, talks about quote, the war's total of unlived lives. And what she's referring to there is this strange practice that we might sort of number among the casualties of war, not just lives lost in the sense of service people or civilians who have been killed, but all kinds of lives that have been rendered sort of unlivable, potential lives, right? What might have been. So either the lives that soldiers or civilians killed in the conflict might have lived had they survived, but also the possibilities for how people who had lived through times of war, what their lives would have looked like if the war hadn't happened. So if the person that they were engaged to be married to, for example, hadn't been killed in the conflict, they might have married that person, they might have had different children, or, think about all of the societal changes that go through war. So women's employment opportunities improved drastically because of the war. So women had experiences and gained skills through a wartime context, but there might have been an unlived life where they had different skills and opportunities manifested in a different way. So Bowen's sense in that novel, and actually throughout her body of work, that somehow the casualties of war are not just bodies but possibilities, I found really, really interesting. And it became part of my way of thinking about, back to what we were talking about earlier, actually, how literature responding to war and conflict might have this sort of, some of it might have this sort of strangely conservative almost bent to it, because if you think about this idea of unlived lives as this idea of this ghostly continuation of what was going to happen before change occurred that was radical, it's actually quite a conservative idea that things are staying the same. But what Bowen, I think, is sort of capturing in thinking about those as casualties is that people felt the loss of the old world, and they almost wanted to sort of shore up their identity by thinking about, well, if this hadn't happened, I would have been this person, or somehow psychologically keeping in touch with their unlived life was a way of not having to completely remake yourself, not having to think about yourself as somebody completely different, which involves quite a lot of psychological work. So I was really interested in that as a kind of a strain of interest that quite a few modern writers were kind of hatching onto. But you talked about my phrase of thinking of it as a syntactical force in modern writing, and that was something else that I was really interested in, because the three of the writers that I ended up focusing on in my doctoral work and my first book, so James, Bowen and Ishiguro, were all really brilliant prose stylists. So they write quite difficult prose, quite tricky prose, but there's a very sort of careful construction going on there. In the case of James and Bowen in particular, they're quite difficult to read. There's lots of what we would call inverted syntax, so sort of slightly a bit like Yoda speak, the words that appear in a different order, or lots of sort of embedded clauses or ideas. I think when you're reading a sentence that you think it might be going in one way, so talking about something, and then it'll resolve and mean something quite different when you get to the end and read the final clause. And I thought that this was strange because sentences in their writing almost have a kind of unlived life. You're forced to imagine through the act of reading and to conjecture all these sorts of postulations about, what the sense is. And even though you understand when you get to the end of these tricky sentences what's being meant, there's a kind of a ghost of a sort of misreading that I think those two writers in particular are very, very interested in, and they're writers who are sensitive to this kind of unlivedness as a wider thing, and it's there in their syntax. It happens in a similar way in Ishiguro, although not quite the same. He's someone who's very interested in ifs and conditionals. His second novel, An Artist of the Floating World, begins with if, which is a very little word. And you can read sort of the whole of the opening paragraph of that novel, and by the end of it, you can sort of forget the if. You forget that you're reading something that's conditional. And that, again, is a kind of slipperiness and unlivedness that's sort of manifesting in the way he writes. So I was really interested in the connection between these writers being interested in unlived lives as a kind of casualty of war or of living in modernity, but also how their style incorporates that and perpetuates that for the reader in some way, that we have unlived readings, unlived interpretations as well.
Definitely. That's really fascinating. I read Elizabeth Bowen's The Last September when I was an
Wonderful.
undergraduate. Wonderful
Yeah.
book, wonderful book. And I wrote an essay on something quite similar to what we're talking about. I mean, so of course it's written during the 1920s in Ireland, and or it's set in the 1920s in Ireland, and this is during the kind of collapsing of the big house
Yeah,
of
the
old
sort of
Irish.
Anglo-Irish ascendancy class. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And these houses, once symbols of wealth and prosperity and aristocracy, are now symbols. They're almost targets on the backs of these families, and they're effectively symbols of decay and anachronistic kind of presences in these times. And one of the things that struck me about the big house that the title character lives in, she's the daughter of this family that is slowly being pushed out of their, their neighborhood and their lives, is the fact that this house is just crumbling around them, right? And there's so much wealth and money kind of in the house. There are these beautiful figurines from voyages and from all sorts of faraway places, and chandeliers and beautiful expensive carpets and expensive curtains. But Bowen makes it clear that these figurines are dusted and the curtains are fraying and the carpets are dirty and everything is just kind of old and sinking into the past. And the family is effectively becoming very ghostly. And I think that idea of being stuck in the past rather than being able to move forward into this more mercantile middle class future is kind of linked to this idea of an unlived life as well, where you're unable to move forward, you're unable to live in a kind of direction, moving forward rather than circling back, or just moving back or sinking away into the air. This idea of the unlived, I think, is really, I guess, a really fascinating topic for Bowen, because I think she revisits it constantly.
Yeah.
And I think Bowen is a really, really interesting writer when it comes to the inability to move forward and to actually progress in one's life. But I've never thought about her on the level of the syntax actually gesturing to another kind of ghostly life that can never be, or a sentence that can never be. I think that on the level of form is really, really fascinating. That she actually is like referring to everything she's discussing in her actual, in the texture of her words, actually. Yeah, and I also want to turn to the essay that you wrote about this very topic: unlived lives, imaginary widowhood, and Elizabeth Bowen's A World of Love. This is for the Review of English Studies. And in this essay, you aim to dissect, quote, the highly imaginative coping mechanisms that were adopted by women in response to wartime losses. And through this, you pinpoint a kind of imaginary womanhood, quote unquote, which you define as, quote, a form of counterfactual self-fashioning that saw many single women of Bowen's generation elect to view themselves not as spinsters, but as those who would have been married were it not for the conflict. And so it's a really interesting reading of this notion of the what could have been. And it produces these, quote, counterfactual relationships with those lives rendered unlivable and the loves that were denied them on account of World War. So this idea of the counterfactual, I think, is linked very closely with this idea of the optative, and this idea of subjectivity being denied, which I think is really fascinating because it almost assumes that there was a correct path that the subjectivity should have taken, or the subject should have become this mold that was theirs, their birthright almost.
Mm-hmm.
But because of this conflict, this obstacle, they were never able to almost ascend to their true form in some way. And I think it's a really interesting way of thinking about life. It's kind of a depressing way of thinking about life, because what happens when you are put in that situation where you're taken off your true path, you know? But yeah, I would love to hear a little bit about what you think about, I don't know, some of these these
Yeah.
random ideas.
Well, it's so wonderful that you've written on, and The Last September, because actually The Last September and A World of Love are talking to each other quite closely. And I think so I don't know if you know this, but Elizabeth Bowen was also the daughter of a family that owned a big
Yes,
house in Ireland called
yes.
Bowen's Court.
Owen's
And
Court,
she
exactly.
was the last in the line
Yeah.
of the Bowens. And
And she sold it, right, to a
she
farmer who
did,
then
yeah.
sold
So
it. Yeah.
and she was someone a bit like what you were describing, who owned this magnificent house, but even with her literary career, couldn't afford to keep it in the end. And she sold it to someone who I think believed when she was selling it that he was going to live there with his family, but in fact he bulldozed the house and used the land. And she was very, very upset about this. And because her house wasn't actually burnt during the sort of the
Yeah.
unrest in Ireland in the 20s, which is what happens to the house in the last September. And the Bowens survived, and it survived the Second World War as well, but it was destroyed in the 60s, I think, or the late 50s. But I think so. So Bowen is very attentive, I think, because of her reflections on the class to which she belonged in Ireland, about the dangers of thinking about the traditions that you inherit and the expectations that run through families over many, many years, an identity that seems to be sort of set in stone and pre-written, but also being sort of so invested in that identity that one cuts oneself off from the changes of modernity, that it becomes a kind of a living deathliness, as you described it. She's very, very sensitive to that. And A World of Love, the novel you're talking about, is it's written quite a long time after the last September. It's published in 1955, so it's what we call a sort of mid-century work. But it's returning to the setting of the Irish big house, and it's thinking about a family that is very much stuck in the past, and their whole identity is sort of tied to lives that are unlived but have also been rendered unlivable. And it follows the Danby family, and at the center of this are a mother and daughter. One of the daughter is called Jane Danby, and she's in her sort of early 20s, and she's never really been in love, and she's desperate for her first taste of romance. And she spends her long summer holidays in Ireland, where she's mainly surrounded by women and old men, so there's not a lot of romantic prospects for her. And she finds a sort of bundle of old love letters in the attic of this house. And these love letters, it turns out, were written by somebody called Guy, who had been Jane's mother, Lilia's fiance. And Guy had died in the First World War. And Jane reads these letters and she falls in love with Guy through these love letters. She sort of writes herself into the identity of their recipient. And the novel is sort of interested in the fact that actually this unlived and unobtainable romantic relationship with a long dead soldier from the war is actually somehow enfranchising for Jane. She discovers her sort of burgeoning sexuality, and by the end of the novel, when she meets the gaze of a dashing American who jumps off a passenger jet and falls immediately in love with her, she's ready for that. So there's some kind of work being done by this imaginary coping mechanism. It's enfranchising. But Jane's story is contrasted with that of her mother, who's called Lilia, who had been set up to marry this dashing soldier, and he had died in the First World War, and she'd never really got over it. She's a sort of Miss Havisham-esque figure, completely emotionally invested in the life she would have had with this man that never was allowed to happen. And even though she marries a man called Fred, who is Jane's father, she sees herself more as Guy's widow than Fred's wife. So her whole identity is about having once been loved by this wonderful man who didn't survive the war. And Bowen is very attentive to how actually in Lilia's case, this has turned into a kind of, a stagnatory mechanism. Her marriage is crumbling. She has no sense of self-esteem. She's looking to the past all the time. She doesn't recognize the sort of flesh and blood husband that she's got right in front of her. So this is a sort of a twofold way of thinking about, I think, sort of the dualism that comes with these coping mechanisms. And the particular historical context that I argue that Bowen is working with in this novel is what Catherine Holden's term, she's a historian, and it's her term, imaginary widowhood, not mine, but it's a very, very useful term. And she is basically charted a whole load of discourses in the aftermath of the First World War that were very worried about the demographic imbalance between men and women after the conflict. So you'd had 750,000 British soldiers who had been killed, and people were very concerned that women wouldn't be able to find husbands. Now, this is a time when we're still thinking in very heteronormative terms, and where for certain classes of society, Virginia Woolf writes about this in Three Guineas, marriage was the only profession open to women. So these are women who'd been raised still with sort of 19th century discourses of, womanhood being associated with marriage. So almost you were a girl until you were married. So if you were sort of a spinster, you were kind of a 45-year-old girl. There was a kind of sort of sense of you being kind of desexualized and abnormal in some way. It was a sort of very stigmatized position. But in the aftermath of the First World War, there's this anxiety about how do we protect the institution of marriage and yet not ostracize hundreds of, potentially hundreds or thousands of women whose partners, potential partners possibly, had been killed in the war. And what Catherine Holden charts is all sorts of discourses, so newspaper articles, speeches that were given by politicians, even advice that women note in their memoirs as having been given by school teachers, which is encouraging them to see themselves as not sort of unlovable or abnormal, but just bereaved of their potential husbands by the conflict. So what I do in my article is I think actually about this particular sort of historical concrete encouragement of counterfactual thinking, and how Bowen many years later is thinking about the positive and negative aspects of that way of thinking, that it can be both enfranchising, but also if it goes on too long, it can actually be damaging to a society. And it's almost as though, because this is a mid-century novel that's, happening quite a long time after the end of the First World War, Bowen is saying, this has helped a lot of women secure their identities and get over, difficult challenges in terms of how we think about female enfranchisement or female identity in the early 20th century. But being enthralled to the past can also be dangerous. And we've got to 1955 now, and there needs to be a reckoning. So I think it's a really sort of balanced and sympathetic novel. It's a lot of fun, and it's tonally very interesting. But I think Bowen's so attentive to this duality. She's not someone who is, out to sort of chastise these coping mechanisms, but she's also very attentive to their cost, I think.
Definitely. I think in the last September, that is a fascinating novel, by the way. I actually really want to read it because I love Bowen and her writing. But I was thinking about this in relation to the last September as well, because I think she doesn't chastise the Anglo-Irish ascendancy class whatsoever. She's not against them because she herself is one of them, would make sense. But I think she does completely think that their place in society is becoming impossible if they don't begin to participate in this mercantile, capitalistic, non-aristocratic society. She sees them going into a kind of stagnation similar to the mother in this text as well. And I think it's interesting about in a world of love, the fact that the unlivability is being perpetuated through literature and through these letters that are kind of anchoring this guy in, his name is Guy and he's a guy, in their lives. It's actually through literature. Whereas in the last September, I don't think literature really functions in that way. It's more the house that's anchoring them in the past, and they're all their possessions that are slowly crumbling, these beautiful, very wealthy, very expensive possessions that are becoming ugly and are becoming dirty and crumbling. But I think the fact that literature features as this anchoring is really interesting in a world of love, because we don't really have
that. And it's actually so one of the things that Bowen gets very interested in during the First World War, she writes this wonderful postscript to the American edition of her wartime short stories, which it's a collection called The Demon Lover. They're absolutely brilliant. And in the preface, in the sort of the postscript that she's writing, she talks about sort of observations that she gained when she was living in wartime London. And she talked about how people who had lost everything, either because their homes had been bombed, or that they were feeling sort of as though the oppressive rules and regulations of wartime London, or just the losses, had sort of eroded their sense of self. And she noticed that people read more, but also that they read family letters, they read sort of old snapshots of their former lives. And she even uses the phrase, they reassembled and checked themselves. through these sort of literary artifacts. So it was almost a way of using literature as a way of, as you say, sort of shoring up and reassembling themselves. I still know myself because, I can read back the letters of my ancestors. I can feel emotions. Or I loved Dickens as a child, and I'm still that child because I'm reading Dickens in the Second World War, and I still keep that part of myself alive. So she was incredibly attentive to this, and she writes an essay around about the same time that she's writing and publishing A World of Love, called The Bend Back. And it's about mid-century literary culture. And she says exactly the same thing. She says that, having come through a world war, there's this huge demand for family memoirs. There's this huge demand for stories set in previous times. And it's partly, as you say, because literature is a way of consoling people, but also reminding them of who they are. And if you think about what's happening in the context of Britain and the British Empire in the aftermath of the Second World War, there's huge changes happening to British identity. And we now see those changes, and the decolonization is all really important changes. But at the time, people were struggling to understand who and what they were, and often it's looking back to the past and to previous traditions and works of literature, or family archives, that they achieve that. So I think you're absolutely right that A World of Love, because of its sort of mid-century context, is so attentive to that kind of psychological work done by literature and traditional literature of various sorts.
Definitely, yeah. I think people find their identities in a lot of the literature they read because they remember the emotional processes of reading it when they were that past identity. And you're right, it harkens back to how they feel now. They still feel like that child being read a fairy tale, in essence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there's a wonderful essay as well that Bowen writes called Out of a Book. And she's reflecting on all of the books that she read when she was a little girl. And in that essay, she talks about, she says, reduced to what did happen, my life would be unrecognizable to me. And what she means there is the fact that so many of her most formative experiences happened either in her imagination, or, when she hung out with the Scarlet Pimpernel, or when she went to Jane Austen's, tea parties in Jane Austen, that actually unlived literary experiences are incorporated into people's identities. And she's a writer, I think, as we've been appreciating and discussing in our chat here, who's so sensitive to how much of who and what we are arises from these sort of unlived sources. And I think that's probably why she's so sensitive to how they help people get through war and conflict, I think.
That's really interesting. The idea of the unlived being a feature of literature in general, as well as in wartime, the unlived, featuring in a negative way in times of war and times of conflict, but actually the unlived being also an essential feature of literature in a positive way.
Yeah.
So you kind of have those two in tandem, I guess. But I think you're right about. I think Bowen definitely points to what happens when the unlived of literature and the unlived of wartime experience, when they cross over in a negative way, where the unlived actually prevents you from living. Exactly. So not as escape, but actually the unlived becomes the not lived, in essence.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And this is something that goes through lots of the writers that I worked on in my PhD thesis. So there's a wonderful Henry James story from 1900 called Maud Evelyn, and it's another sort of tricky James plot when I paraphrase it for you, but it's essentially about a man who asks his childhood sweetheart to marry her, and she refuses him, and he goes off to Europe and to sort of try and pick himself up. And during his time in Europe, he meets an elderly couple who sort of look after him, and he travels around with them, to sort of Italy and France for a bit. And over the course of talking to this couple, he learns that they had a little girl who had died about 15 years previously when she was still a child. But this couple, to sort of console themselves, act as if she's still alive. And they manage to convince this young man to marry their long dead daughter, whose name is Maud Evelyn of the title. And the plot is very sort of interested in the ridiculousness of this. It's narrated, there's a sort of dual narration. So we're being told this story by someone who was told it at a party by one of this young man's friends who thought this whole thing was completely insane. But the tale is really attentive both to the imaginative richness of creating an entire life, one for a child who had died, but also an entire marriage that's emotionally sustaining all in your head. So there's a kind of creative richness there that's appropriate and sort of almost amusing in a work of fiction, right? This is sort of playing on the idea that both James as writer and us as readers get invested in things that don't actually exist. But it also, through the workings of the story, shows this old married couple who've lost their daughter as people who don't really live in the world, who shut themselves up in their London house and haven't got over their grief. Freud would say it would be where mourning turned into melancholia, right? And also the young woman that had originally refused this man, the one who's alive, she continues to sort of be his friend, and she's watching the fact that neither of them have actually ended up married or happy, because she turned him down and he's committed himself to a woman who's not even alive. And interestingly, I've written about this a little bit, but Maud Evelyn is the title of that story, and one of the characters in a World of Love is called Maud, and both of those go back to sort of Tennyson's poem Maud, which is also about being a speaker who's sort of obsessed with someone who's possibly no longer living. But there's a whole sort of body of fiction that's really interested, as you say, in this sort of the risks to life and to creation and all of these things if we get too absorbed in things that are not really living, or ideas that don't have purchase in the real world.
Definitely. It makes me think a little bit about academia. What are we doing just reading things that are fake, essentially fiction, and us as
Yeah,
academics, we are not in the real world.
it's quite a
It's
depressing
quite funny,
thought. I mean,
actually.
I think to take it away from depressing meditations on academia, but I think you're right in the sense that it's not coincidental that authors get interested in these kinds of plots, because the analogous thing is that they spend a lot of time creating and emotionally investing in worlds and unlived possibilities. And
Definitely.
James and Ishiguro being the third writer that I looked at in my doctorate, both James and Ishiguro have a big strain of sort of stories about people who reach the end of their lives and look back at them and wonder whether they fully lived. There's that
Yeah.
wonderful phrase from James's novel The Ambassadors that occurs where a character called Lambert Strether says, "Live all you can, it is a shame not to." And you think about The Remains of the Day by Ishiguro, and that novel being a meditation about someone who worries towards the end of his life whether he has actually spent it well, whether he's wasted his life in service of a master who was made bad moral decisions and was a bad man, and that in having invested so much in his profession he also missed the chance to perhaps have a romantic relationship. So whether or not we as academics end up thinking this way, certainly I think that we could speculate that it's not coincidental that authors end up thinking about these things, for sure.
No, definitely. No, and of course I'm just kidding. I think also the fact that what we were talking earlier about guilt, and the fact that thoughts can have their own guilt attached to them, and you can be guilty by guilty by association of thought, let's say, shows how powerful the mental non-physical world is, actually. As in that text that you were bringing up about the women who were all guilty because they had a thought to marry this man, or even a mental crush on him. But that does show how powerful the realm of the mental and the spiritual and the intellectual and the fictive is.
Yeah.
And so I think if we do give strength and recognition to the unlivedness of the fictive realm, I think it's extremely important. I think it's extremely powerful. Just like in A World of Love, how she literally had her sexual awakening through these unlived letters, both
Yeah,
unlived in the sense of them being written down. They're not actually in the physical realm, but also unlived in the sense that they never actually happened. So
yeah,
she's reading about them rather than living them, and they in fact did never happen for the person about whom they were, who they were about. So there are kind of two aspects of that unlivedness. But I think the conclusion, I think, of all of these intersecting roads potentially may be, I think, lying in Bowen, and the fact that when the unlived crosses over into being unable to live, as those
yeah,
parents were unable to live, that's where it becomes concerning, let's say.
yeah,
So there's immense power in it, because it can be a tool to live actually more confidently, more happily, in a stronger, more light, bright way, to enjoy your life better with these fictive realms, with the unlived. So it can be a
mm,
tool for happiness, or it can be a tool for misery and
yeah.
being unable to live. So it actually all depends on how you use these unlived realms.
Absolutely. And I think, there's there's all kinds of really interesting questions that we can think about in terms of, consolation and the ethics of that. So one way of thinking about this is that, if you can use the gift of imagination to put things right in your mind, or through imaginative escapes, or through fantasy, does it make you less likely to perform the sort of political actions that require to actually improve your life and improve the lives of other people? So there's a whole sort of conversation as well that, that we could have about the place of this in terms of, are we privileging sort of quite individualistic consolation? So, you've lost someone in times of war and you need to feel better about it. So, there's this kind of fantasy element, and you're using these sort of fantastical or imaginative mechanisms to get through the day and to mediate and manage your own bereavement. So that seems to be quite a sympathetic example. But if, the creation of literature or the creation of fantasies becomes a way of sort of pacifying a broader group of people, or satisfying them through art and through fantasy, such that there is no need to go and improve the real world,
Mm,
that seems quite sort of ethically dodgy. So,
definitely,
and there's
definitely,
ways of,
or potentially pacifying yourself,
yeah,
or
exactly,
potentially
right.
pacifying yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's all really about, I don't know, thinking through these really quite challenging ways of viewing, is imagination a gift or a curse? That's a really sort of reductive way of putting it. But I think what we're circling around here is this idea of, to what extent does consoling ourselves through the imagination, how far can we push that, and at what point does it tip over into something that's actually distortive and destructive? And I think a lot of the work that I've been doing has been sort of reading the writing of figures from the 20th century who were fascinated by this question, and couldn't resolve it, but felt that it was incredibly important to ask, particularly in the aftermath of war and conflict, when almost the immediate on the ground sense is that people just need to feel better, right? Pain is raw, and there's a kind of sense in which managing that feels like it's almost like, there's an open wound and you've got to put a band-aid on it. You've got to sort that. But actually the harder questions are about perhaps, moving on and engaging and rebuilding and creating things that are new. So yeah, these are incredibly important questions, and they're tricky for readers, I think, as well as writers to
Yeah,
navigate.
definitely. And I was thinking when you were saying that thing about, putting the band-aid on, because you may bleed out because you are in such a time of crisis.
Yeah,
I think that is where the unlived or imaginative aspects of your mind and your, what may have been this kind of coping mechanisms, the soothing mechanisms, that is where those come in handy. And I think those can be used very effectively and maybe are actually necessary. But then I was thinking, as you were speaking, what happens then? I think at that point you have to think, once you're out of that time of crisis, if you are ever out of it, if the war ever ends, which hopefully, as it did in Bowen's case, it did, and hopefully it would. But what happens then? Do you stay with the band-aid on your mind forever and you're unable to move on, or do you find a way to start living again? Because I think that is where you are stuck in the wartime forever, as is the mother in A World of Love. She effectively, I would say, is still living in a time of war with her dead husband, right? She's not living in a time that has come out of war. She's still living in a time of war. So I think that's when people are transported psychologically back to the past and are
Yeah.
unable to continue living in the present, when the band-aid cannot be removed. So I think potentially it's necessary in a wartime, but then if the war ever ends, it must maybe one day come off if you are to be psychologically healthy again. I don't know. It's
Yeah, well,
definitely a deep
yeah,
question.
it's a really difficult question, and I think, sort of, if we're thinking about principles to live by, it would be incredibly, unique to the individual. I think certainly in the work of the writers that I've been looking at, what you say is right, that there's a sense of finding what I ended up writing about in my notes, and when I teach this, I use this phrase, sort of life-giving fictions. So fictions that allow people, in Bowen's phrase, to survive not only physically but spiritually. But surviving is not, sort of something that ends once you've got through the war. It's living on beyond that, and living on requires, sort of beliefs about the world, or distortions or deceptions. Ishiguro is very fond of, we have to deceive ourselves in order to keep on living in certain times and through certain times and with certain personal histories. But it has to be enfranchising. It has to be something that allows people to live in the world and to survive all that they are, all that they've done, the past and the future. And that seems to be where these writers find themselves sort of trying to map out that territory, because there's a sense in which a lot of, I'm not a psychologist, but certainly from the work of psychological novelists that I've engaged with, there's an understanding that a lot of the mental work we do is about sort of telling stories about ourselves and our lives and our identities that are enfranchising, that allow us to live with and as ourselves, or as ethically responsible human beings, as good citizens of the world, etc. And that it's about having that kind of relationship to storytelling, to sort of distortions or deceptions or imagination. But I'm completely willing to say that it's entirely personal, and it's something that's very difficult to generalize about.
Definitely. And I think you're completely right about, once the war does end, there's no way you can just rip off whatever band-aid you have put on your psyche to get through it, because you're right, it continues, you're right, every day beyond that. So it almost is, I think war in Bowen, and I think in the other novels we're discussing as well, it does kind of function as something that anchors one in the past, and potentially something that you are unable to ever move on from. And that's why there's that unlived aspect of the life that could have been. So I definitely agree with what you were saying about it actually every day constantly having to negotiate with your psyche and with your being, and to see how you then fit in and what happens after then. Can your life be lived, or is it forever unlived? I don't know. It's a question, I guess.
Yeah,
Yeah. What were you gonna say? Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think these are really important questions, and it's partly why I did a project and I wrote a book that sort of looked at the whole of the 20th century, because I was really interested in this idea of long lives. So Bowen's a great example of this, in that she is alive for both the First World War and the Second World War. She's born in 1899, so she often joked that she was the same age as the 20th century. So she was 19 in 1919, and there were several people of that generation who lived through two world wars, but also lived beyond them, and having to think about, you look back over your life and you sort of construct a narrative about who you are and what you've done, and incorporating sort of, you know, aberrations of that level into your personal history is a challenging task, and accounting for sort of that period of time in the context of a life that was longer and more complicated and had all other kinds of changes in it is something that I think as well her writing's very perceptive about, because that's a challenge itself.
Definitely, definitely. Okay, firstly, I want to say thank you so much for joining me today. Before I ask our last question, I just want to say it's been an absolute pleasure, and I want to say thank you so much. And I've
Thank you so
learned
much for having me.
I hope everyone listening has as well. And so my kind of closing question for you is there any chance, can you please give us a sneak peek of your upcoming book, 20th Century Literature in the Aftermath of War? What can we expect? What text will it cover? What kind of conclusions will it draw? Just a few sentences, a few thoughts. I would love to hear a little sneak peek.
Well, I think the main sneak peek has been our chat today, because if you enjoyed what we were talking about,
Amazing.
it's a lot of these questions. So it looks at literary responses to war and conflict from the American Civil War through to the aftermath of the Holocaust in Ishiguro's writing, and it looks at figures like Henry James, Elizabeth Bowen, Rebecca West, Kazuo Ishiguro. There's some W.G. Sebald in there. And it's thinking about, yes, what we've been chatting about today, an account of war literature that's attentive to, you know, this more sort of slightly conservative or traditional formal perpetuation and formal response, but also how thinking about unlived lives and coping mechanisms is very present in all of these texts. And actually it's writing an account of 20th century literature that's attentive to all of those things and saying, well, how does that change our understanding of what war literature looks like, and how does that change our understanding of, you know, counterfactuals and their importance in the context of the 20th century. So thank you so much for giving me a chance to talk about it. It's been such a pleasure, and thank you so much, Daphne.
Oh, of course. No, it's been really interesting. I think there are certain things that I actually have never even thought about before. I hope people listening feel the same way. And I think a lot of these questions that we're asking are really abstract, really complex, and there are really no right or wrong answers. So I think it's just kind of some food for thought for everyone, and I find it really fascinating. So thank you
Yeah,
again.
that's
And I hope you have a brilliant rest of your day. Yeah.
you too. You too. Have a lovely day. Take care. Bye.